This is for you, Steven, and for anybody else that watches this. I I hope it helps. I'm gonna lay this out in a couple of points, and I hope it helps. These are things that I've struggled with for years and years, and it has not been easy to come across these answers and to accept these answers, but I believe them to be true, and I hope that they will go a long ways towards helping you, whoever sees this. The first of these difficult questions is the idea that God allows human suffering. This is a tough one, but the truth is, God created us to be perfect in His image. That is, He created us to be creators rather than manipulators. Satan knew this when he insinuated that perhaps God had not really said, "Thou shalt not eat," and followed it by promising that by eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve would become like God. Now remember, God is perfect and thus can have no part of sin. So he, Satan, promised this as if Adam and Eve were not already the spitting image of God and His perfect design. Adam and Eve fell for the deception without question, only to realize that the result was the exact opposite. That is, by eating of the forbidden fruit, they would become separated from God. This was the desired result Satan intended by flipping the truth on its head as if the truth did not exist. Remember, Satan sought to usurp the throne of Almighty God in his quest to be not the light bearer, but the light itself. This is the root of Satan's hatred for light and all that light illumes. So, by A, asking a question to undermine faith in reality, and B, flipping the reality of godhood on its head by behaving as if God were hiding something from His image-created children. That is, by accusing God of lying, Satan made himself out to be the bearer of truth. This medium is in use even to this day. Since Adam and Eve knew the result of their deception, they were spiritually and physically... Since Adam and Eve knew the result of their deception, that they were spiritually and physically naked before God, they also experienced the first instance of shame, the primary response to a recognition of sin. When God asked them what they had done, they did as children will do, and laid the blame on external factors, a sin we all commit when we are ashamed of our initial disobedience. In this, Satan thought himself victorious, even knowing that he would lose his wings and his limbs, and be forced to crawl the earth in dust and darkness. Remember, this is an important point, a very important point. Serpents embody all that is relative to sin, and indeed exist to this day for that expressed, purposed warning. To this day, limbless evil is incapable of creation, and so seeks to deceive and coerce Adam and Eve into doing the work he desires in his ongoing war against God. It is the way of Cain that evil be perpetrated under the guise of humanistic righteousness. "Who am I, my brother's keeper?" he asked. "I have written as well of the city of Cain and the law of retribution he established in his cult of serpentine worship elsewhere." The second point is, those who seek God find Him. Abraham walked with God and had in him a relationship that was personal and devoted, even though Abraham himself was a son of Adam and subject to sin. Abraham sinned against God in the matter of Hagar, in that he was not patient for the timing of the Lord, for fear that he and Sarai, now Sarah, would die without children, in spite of God's promise that his descendants would be too numerous to count. We are. At his wife's insistence, Abraham took Hagar to bed. And from this disobedient union came Ishmael, the father of the Ishmaelites. In this, God was not mocked. For 12 years later, Isaac was born, further proving that evil could not undo the work of God. Years later, Sarai, now Sarah, became bitter over the result of her role in the birth of Ishmael and insisted without ceasing that Ishmael and Hagar be sent away. Accordingly, Ishmael and Hagar were sent away. When Ishmael almost died in the desert, Hagar called upon the Lord and he rescued them and sent them to Egypt. God does not withhold love from anyone who asks. Another important thing to note. And it is important here to note that Hagar and Ishmael were of Canaanite blood, and historically would have been followers of the ancient Canaanite cults, Marduk, Moloch, and the like, serpent gods with a taste for human sacrifice. In Egypt, Hagar and Ishmael found favor, and Ishmael married into the Egyptian cult with the help of his mother. The Egyptian cult marries the Canaanite cult. Some years later, Joseph is sold into slavery to the Ishmaelites by his brothers, and so went the same road as Ishmael to Egypt, eventually becoming indoctrinated into the Egyptian cult as referenced in the account. The Israelites later sold themselves into slavery to Joseph, only to regret this many years later, when the Egyptian cult forced them to build for them their temples and their places of cult practition. Cults cannot create, for they are of evil. They can only manipulate that which is created. That's why they had the slaves. That's why they have the blood sacrifices. That's why they do all the things that they do. But they have to wait around for somebody to first do it before they can flip it on its head, subvert it. That is the nature of sin and evil. That's it. And many years later, when 400 years later, the children of Abraham cried out to God, as had Hagar, and the Lord provided them with a deliverer, as with Hagar, a flawed, rebellious man named Moses. Moses went before the Egyptian cult and demanded that they let the people of God return to the land once promised as an eternal home to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember, 400 years have passed, and Canaan is now ruled by the cults of Marduk and Moloch, serpent gods, sacrificers of innocents upon altars of debauchery. And it's only gotten worse as time has gone on. You can take that completely separate from the Bible. You can actually go through and study the histories of these Canaanite people, of these ancient Egyptian groups, and you'll see how it matches up with the biblical account. On its own two legs, even. Now, this cult, remember, relies on child sacrifice, demonic possession, the perversion of astronomy into astrology, the perversion of mathematics into numerology, and the perversion of righteousness into desecration. Now, the Magi of Egypt were only able to conjure spells that fell into specific categories, and no more. So, when faced with Moses and Aaron, think demon possession of frogs, snakes, flies, and gnats, filling the water with blood and the like. They could not, however, produce any of the signs beyond this. When at last Pharaoh let the people of God go, he flipped his promise on its head again. We see that. That's what a lie is. It's literally the reversal of God's design. And pursued them, taking his entire army, but leaving behind his family. Now, his family, these cult worshippers, from that day to this, think the 6 Days War, swore an oath of retribution against the people of God, which likewise continues to this day. Think Holy Roman Church of the occult. God is not petty, though he is jealous of his bride creation, as any husband would rightfully be. When he ordered the Israelites to destroy all of Canaan, it was not because he favored one people over another, for If indeed I be lifted up, I shall call all men unto me. That was his prophecy before he died for the sins of all of us. But God behaved the way he did because the Canaanites knew God, and they knew his ways well, and they hated him for casting Satan out of heaven, whom they worshipped. Yet, they practiced their evil arts without regard to this personal knowledge. Remember, Abraham and his relationship with God was well known by these selfsame Canaanites. God knew that the Israelites would be either destroyed outright or destroyed by assimilation. And likewise he knew that the Canaanites had no intention of following him, for they worshipped the serpent. The cult of Egypt, however, followed the Israelites in the form of followed the Israelites out of Egypt. This cult followed the Israelites in the form of the cult of Korah, who quickly sought to subvert the Israelites to their control. So these were the guys that, when the Egyptians were in control, the cult of Korah wanted to be in control of the Israelites, those who dwelt in the land of Goshen. As soon as the Israelites were gone, the cult of Korah comes forth and presents itself as a replacement for Moses and Aaron, and God's will and design. So, summarily, God wiped them out, as a father kills the man who beds his wife or seeks harm upon his children. Seems reasonable to me when you put it into that perspective. Now, when the Israelites reached the land of Canaan for the first time, they allowed fear to overcome their faith and so turned away. And God caused them to wander the desert until their fear of man became once more faith in the fear of God. And again he fulfilled his work in them. This is repeated throughout history. Your life, my life. It's not about the Israelites. It's about our relationship with our Creator. Literally the most important thing in the entire universe, right? Again, the Israelites did as the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve were wont to do, and only partially obeyed God, leading eventually to them even begging God for a return to their slavery, and that they begged God for a king, that we might be like all the other nations. They lusted for the perceived joy of separation with God, which was a knowing disobedience to God and his design. And the cycle continues to repeat even today. And in that, there is no argument. There is no contravention against this. No question and no doubt. It is the very essence of the war of God versus Satan, of good versus evil. And so it shall be until the end of this earth and age. Now, the third thing I come to that's a difficulty is the Ten Commandments. Now, each of these commandments was broken in the early days of Genesis in one way or another. And God knew that without a constant reminder represented in immutable stone, that the Israelites would fall into these sins again, which we, did and do repeatedly. When the Israelites demonstrated to God that they did not want grace, but law, he gave them law, which they proceeded to ignore almost immediately. The litany of laws, precepts, and guidelines were in preparation for the inevitable collapse of those self-same laws, precepts, and guidelines. That is, God is willing to let you do your thing, your way, just to let you see how it's going to end up working out. But if you set your face against him directly, if you start joining these subversive serpents, that's a completely different story, and no, don't want to touch that. That is, the law is unto itself death, whereas grace is unto itself life. This was a major theme of Jesus' message, that the law could not save, but that trust and faith in God saves all. The Israelites, much like their Roman Catholic descendants, refused this relationship with God, so had no part in grace, and only death under the law. Thus far, we see not a contradiction on the part of Creator God, but contradictions in numero on the part of simple man. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. This is why, when writing the book of Hebrews, Paul, a former Pharisaic Jew, wrote so persistently about the consequence of the law when upheld over the redemption that comes from grace. The reason that I mentioned him being a Pharisaic Jew is because he was not just a Jew, but he was a Jew in the know, so to speak. Now, as the story continues, the exact same deception is repeated. Did God really say? Did God really say? And flat out, God lied when he said. From commission to result, this pattern of deception is without refutation. And I will move on to the rest of this video at another time, because I think this is about the limit of what I have. Bear with me. If there's any other questions, I'll try and do my best to help and answer them out, okay? I love you very much. Thanks for listening, Steve.